Hello, my name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. The 2020 edition of the Almanac of American Politics is here with comprehensive, up-to-date information on the national political landscape. If you're really into politics, this is such a cool resource. I actually have the edition of this book from the year 2000, and I can tell you I pretty much wore it out. Since 2016, Ballotpedia has partnered with Columbia Books to produce the Almanac, which comes out every other year. Today, we'll be taking a look at the coverage and scope of the Almanac, as well as what's new in the 2020 printing. Joining me today is David Lukes, who's a staff writer with Ballotpedia, who worked on the Almanac research team. Thanks for joining us, David.
It's great to be here, Dave.
All right, so just to start off, could you give our attendees a quick overview of what readers will find in the 2020 Almanac?
Absolutely, Dave. So the Almanac of American Politics contains in-depth biographies of the President and Vice President, all 100 U.S. Senators, all 435 U.S. Representatives, the 6 non-voting territorial delegates to the U.S. House, and all 50 state governors. There's also a detailed profile of all 50 states, the District of Columbia, the 5 insular territories, and each individual U.S. House district. And the appendix contains information on committee assignments and historical voting trends. So all told, the Almanac is just over 2,000 pages of political data.
That is very comprehensive. In fact, the edition from 2000 I'm holding right now only has 1,800 pages, so it just keeps getting bigger. Before we get into the specifics, would you mind taking us through the Almanac's history?
Certainly. So the Almanac has been published once every 2 years, starting in 1971. It was published by National Journal between 1983 and 2015, which was when Columbia Books took over publication. And Ballotpedia partners with Columbia Books to provide research support. So this is the 3rd Almanac which Ballotpedia staff have worked on.
Can you tell us a little bit about the main writers of the Almanac?
Yeah, of course. The chief author of the 2020 Almanac is Rich Cohen, who served as the Almanac's co-author for the 2002 through 2010 editions. And he's covered Congress for decades and written for publications including the National Journal, Politico, and Congressional Quarterly. The 2020 Almanac's co-author is Charlie Cook, who serves as editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report and as an NBC News analyst. He has decades of experience with election night coverage with CBS, CNN, and NBC. And the two are among a team of 17 authors, editors, and writers who collectively worked on putting the 2020 Almanac together.
Yeah, both of those two gentlemen are very prominent and have been for a long time in the political world. So exactly what role did you and the other Ballotpedia writers play in putting the 2020 edition together?
Well, we were the research team for the Almanac, so our role was tracking down news articles, analysis pieces, and facts and figures for the Almanac's writers to reference when writing and updating profiles. So each state, district, and politician profile was updated with any recent developments or news from the past 2 years. And in some cases, this actually meant assembling 50 or more articles just for a single profile.
That's a lot of research. Can you tell us what features are new in the 2020 Almanac?
Yeah, each of the individual profiles has been updated to reflect events since the 2018 Almanac was published, and in particular, the midterm elections. The 2020 edition also contains up-to-date voter registration data, and there are all new profiles for each of the 93 freshman members of the U.S. House, as well as all of the newly elected senators and governors. And the 2020 Almanac is the first that includes lists of statewide elected officials in its state profiles.
So it sounds like there's a lot of variety in the Almanac's coverage, and I know from talking to you and some of the other researchers that there was so many things that you learned when you were doing it. Was there anything in particular that you found particularly interesting?
I would say that doing research on the individual congressional districts was probably the most fascinating part. Our goal was to get a sense for the lay of the land in each of these districts. And because of the level of detail that was involved in those profiles, we had to track down all the major events that took place since the last Almanac was published in 2017. And this meant looking for whether any major employers had opened or closed in the area, if there were any natural disasters that had occurred, and whether there were any noteworthy crime or public health or demographic trends. We even looked at travel guides for information on each district's major landmarks. This was a particularly challenging and rewarding process for major cities that have multiple congressional districts like New York and Chicago, since we often had to search neighborhood by neighborhood to see what the big stories were in each district. And it was just a really fascinating experience to learn so much about day-to-day life and local issues across the country. And the writing in the Almanac does a great job of bringing all of this research to life.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds that way. All right, I'm gonna put you on the spot here and ask you, what would you say are the three most interesting things you learned while working on the Almanac?
Oh, well, it's hard to pick just three. One that jumps out was an article I came across while doing research on the 2017 U.S. Senate special election in Alabama between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. And the author of this article overlaid geological maps with the election results and found that certain bands of rock that have been in Alabama for hundreds of millions of years correlated with votes for Doug Jones, who was, of course, the Democratic candidate. And it turns out that that particular type of sediment leads to particularly fertile soil, and it meant that those areas had more plantations and therefore a larger African American population still through to this day, which has impacted their local voting trends.
That is amazing. What an unexpected link.
Yeah, it really was a fascinating story. Another interesting fact came about while I was researching Indiana's profile. And the federal government has traditionally called residents of the state Indianans, while people from Indiana tend to call themselves Hoosiers. And in January 2017, federal agencies actually updated the name at the request of Indiana politicians Dan Coates and Joe Donnelly. So Hoosiers is actually now the official federal government term for residents in Indiana.
Well, as anybody who's a basketball fan would know, that would almost seem intuitive. But that's really interesting that took that long to go to the official status. And the third one?
Yeah, I'd say the last fact would be Bakersfield, California was the site for a large number of migrants from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas who relocated during the Dust Bowl. And in the 1950s, this actually led to the city becoming the center of its own style of country music, which blended a more traditional country sound with California-style rock and roll. And this cultural difference is also reflected in the city's politics to this day. So that was just really fascinating to see how that continues to impact, again, local politics.
That's really, really fascinating. So it clearly sounds that the research behind the Almanac was broad and not just limited to politics. So can you go into a little bit more detail about what the research process was like? How did you approach finding all these stories?
Yeah, it was a very intensive process. We paced ourselves to just focusing on getting 4 profiles worth of research each day in order to have enough time to find all the relevant information. Most of our research was conducted by combing through local news articles dating back to about 2017 and trying to find any relevant stories. And then whenever we found a story that was worth including, we would go back and search in more detail to find either a single source or a mix of sources that both provided the most relevant information while also capturing narratives from across the political spectrum. And through it all, we always referred back to the 2018 Almanac to make sure that we were following up on all the stories that it discussed.
That sounds like an extremely thorough process. Did any particular type of this research stand out?
Yeah, the research process was particularly intensive for the district profiles. And this is because news stories about, say, a factory being opened don't tend to mention which congressional district the factory is in. So we needed to get creative with search terms by working in the names of population centers in the district, as well as local names for regions, like, say, the southern tier of New York, and then combining each term with a series of keywords that covered everything from jobs and crime to weather and agriculture.
You know, one thing that I think is totally underappreciated is just how large the United States is. Every time I get an airplane and fly anywhere, I just am amazed. So did this process change at all as you went from state to state?
Yeah, many of the states involved additional work in some form or another. So, for instance, Pennsylvania underwent court-ordered redistricting in 2018, and this meant that the district lines, which we referenced in the last almanac, didn't apply anymore. So each of those Pennsylvania profiles involved researching the new district boundaries on the state government's website, then seeing which of the old districts they overlapped with, then dividing out the old districts profiles from the 2018 almanac based on which of the new districts each story applied to, and only then going through the regular research process.
We all know that redistricting in Pennsylvania was a big story last year in the elections, and it obviously filtered down to the almanac. I'm curious just how much detail goes into these district profiles. Are there any examples that stand out?
Well, I distinctly remember the research I did on Alabama, and this is because it was just one of the first states that I worked on, kind of my introduction to the process. And one of the big stories in Alabama in the past couple of years was an announcement by Toyota and Mazda that they would open a new manufacturing plant in the 5th district. And the Almanac's district profile does mention that story, but it also explores Huntsville, Alabama's history as a center of American rocket manufacturing, a new missile defense contract that the local Boeing plant won, the FBI's decision to relocate an explosives analysis center to the district, the expansion of a local research park, and the trends behind Huntsville's rapid population growth. And it finishes out with a paragraph exploring the district's political evolution from being dominated by New Deal Democrats in the 1950s through when it first elected a Republican to Congress in 2010.
That's an amazing amount of detail. It sounds like you probably could serve on the Chamber of Commerce in a lot of these districts. What sort of facts and figures does in terms of details and data, does the Almanac provide for each district?
Well, each district profile contains the district's Cook Partisan Voter Index, and this is a measure of how much the district tends to favor Democratic or Republican presidential candidates compared to the nation as a whole. There are also district-level results for the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, and a whole series of demographic figures, which include overall population, a breakdown by race and age, economic indicators, and active military status. And these figures also include an overview of how many of the district's residents have health insurance, and of how many are receiving public assistance.
So we've pretty much confirmed that the coverage of the district profiles is just not only extensive and exhaustive, but really, really fascinating. Let's change gears a little bit and talk about what sort of information the Almanac has on the members of Congress themselves.
Yeah, so each member profile contains basic biographical information, including date of birth, degrees earned, immediate family, and professional and electoral history. But there's also contact information for each of the members' offices, a list of their committee assignments, and an overview of their voting record. So this takes the form of the members' scorecard rankings from 10 separate organizations, as well as a custom almanac ranking of their political ideology on economic, social, and foreign policy issues. So all of this together gives you an idea of what the members' ideological positioning in Congress is. In the same vein, the Almanac also lists the members' votes on 12 key bills that came before the 115th Congress. So this would be including the American Health Care Act and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
And I understand that the Almanac includes additional information on members of the leadership.
Yeah, for high-profile lawmakers, there's even more detail. This includes an overview of their strengths and their priorities as a legislator. So, for instance, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's profile discusses his skill in working directly with other legislators and balancing the priorities of different factions within the Republican Party. Senator Dick Durbin's profile delves into what his working relationship is like with Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who actually used to be his roommate.
That's interesting. What sort of information is included about the midterm congressional elections that just happened not even a year ago, 2018?
Yeah, so if a member of Congress ran for re-election in 2018, the Almanac includes details on what happened in both the primary and the general. This includes an overview of campaign spending and vote totals, and there's also a list outlining what percentage of the vote that member received in every previous election. For close races, the Almanac goes into additional detail on what happened over the course of the election, maybe what some of the key moments were, what some of the factors were that caused it to turn out the way it did.
Yeah, that's incredible. Okay, now stepping outside of Washington a little bit, which in the political world we tend to focus a lot on. Now let's pivot over towards the states. What kind of coverage is there about the governors?
Yeah, well, a lot of the nuanced comparisons between members of Congress are possible because they're all debating and voting on a common set of issues. Every member of the US House has a vote on the same set of bills and is rated by the same scorecard agencies. But each state's governor deals with a really unique set of political concerns. So while the biographical details are the same, there isn't a scorecard or an ideological analysis for the governors. Instead, each governor's profile contains extra information about state government, including information about partisan control of the state legislature, and other top executive offices.
That makes sense, David. What sort of additional detail is included instead for the governors?
Well, because governors have a major potential to shape their state's policies as chief executive, the gubernatorial profiles really zero in on what the governor's priorities and executive style look like. So, for instance, Hawaii Governor David Ige's profile explores how he broke with tradition by meeting every other week with Hawaii's legislative leaders to set a common agenda, while most of his predecessors governed in the mold of a traditional grand chief. It also goes into detail on the state level issues that shaped Ige's first term, including the debate over whether Hawaii should be the site of the world's largest telescope and the campaign to open Kona Airport to international flights.
That's again some really fascinating stuff. How about the different state profiles?
Yeah, each of the statewide profiles contains an overview of the state's history and political leanings, as well as a summary of the major issues on the state level over the past 2 years. It also includes the same set of demographic information that you'd find in the district level profiles. Each state profile also has a map which outlines the state's major cities and includes congressional district boundaries. For urban areas like Los Angeles, where there are a large number of congressional districts packed into a very small area, there's also an inset showing each district in more detail, so you can always tell sort of exactly where the boundaries are between districts. And finally, each state overview also examines the state's presidential voting history and analyzes the history of redistricting in that state.
All right, and now we've talked about both the members of Congress, the governors, the states, the districts, and there's even more. There's even an appendix. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the appendix is just chock full of political facts and figures. So it includes an overview of who occupies congressional leadership positions, a list of every member of Congress by seniority, a full list of assignments and contact information for each committee and each subcommittee. There's also an overview of voter registration and turnout, and possibly my favorite part, a table of exit poll results for each presidential election since 1992. If you want to see who voters who prioritize the economy were voting for over the years, you can get that information. The Almanac closes out with an extensive series of data tables of historical congressional information, and this was assembled by the Brookings Institution. It includes information on the apportionment of seats, the number of incumbents who were retired and who were defeated in each year, the representation of women and racial minorities, and midterm election results for the president's party.
That's must be an exhaustive amount of data and detail. And then I also understand that some of the senior authors have also put together some essays as well.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dave. The Almanac actually opens with a trio of essays by Charlie Cook, Richard Cohen, and Michael Barone. So the first two explore trends in national and congressional politics since 2016, and they sort of attempt to answer the question of how our politics got to the point where it is today. And the third is an in-depth profile of President Trump and Vice President Pence. So together, the essays set the stage for the entire Almanac, and they're a great introduction to what the political scene looks like in the US in 2019.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion with someone who did so much interesting research, had some great insights, and some really interesting examples. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all that information, David.
Thanks for having me.
So hopefully you've enjoyed this look at the 2020 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Hopefully it gave you a little bit of insight into what went into it and what is the product that would be before you today. If you agree that the Almanac of American Politics sounds like a useful resource that you will spend hours enjoying, we do have a special offer. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, you can visit their website at the almanacofamericanpolitics.com. That's all one word, the Almanac of American Politics.com. And if you include the code in all caps BP Almanac, you can get 10% off of your order. So that's one more incentive if you're considering it. So that's all great stuff. Now, just as we wrap up here, switching gears a bit, there are 2 congressional special elections today in North Carolina. And obviously those results won't be in the 2020 book, but there will be a discussion of the 2018 results, obviously. Those 2 congressional special elections are happening in the 3rd and the 9th districts, and we will have live results from both races on Tuesday night on our site. So please continue to visit ballotpedia.org for updates on all the news about politics. We're not even 2 months away from Election Day 2019. And of course, early in 2020, we'll start up with a lot of the presidential nominating events, such as the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primaries, and the other early state primaries. So we are approaching a very, very busy time in politics. We invite you to keep in the know with all of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Thanks again for watching, everyone.